Hola, buenas tardes a todos. Hoy estamos presentando la quinta conferencia de nuestro
Hello,
ciclo.
good evening. We're presenting the fifth lecture of our series, Photography Speaks of Revolution, which is programmed by the KBR Center of Photography in Barcelona, and it's sponsored by the Mapfre Foundation. We have Leigh Raiford with us from California, with a difference in time quite considerable. Good morning, Leigh. And Leigh Raiford is North American, born in New Haven, Connecticut in 1972. She is professor of Afro-American Studies and of the African diaspora at the University of Berkeley. Leigh Raiford is with us this evening. She's also involved in exhibitions regarding race, gender, justice, and visual dimension in her written work too. She's written several and published several books, some of them in collaboration. For instance, Imprisoned in a Luminous Glare, Photography in the African American Freedom Struggle, 2011. Then she was edited together with Rene Romano, the book The Civil Rights Movement in American Memory, 2006. And she was co-editor with Rafael Hernandez of Migrating the Black Body, the African Diaspora, and Visual Culture, 2017. The lecture that she will share with us today is entitled Being Seen to be Free, Photography and Black Power. Leigh will speak in English, but you can follow the lecture in Spanish by using the simultaneous interpreting service. You have the icon at the bottom on the right of your screen, and you can select the channel. And I remind you also that during the last 30 minutes, we'll have the chance to ask Leigh questions, and that you can send these questions in using the chat on this platform, and we will pass them on to Leigh so that she can answer. That's all from me. I'll be very brief so that she has more time to express what she has to tell us. Thank you, Leigh, very much for being here with us at this forum of the KBR in Barcelona. Welcome.
Gracias a todos. Thank you again to Laura and Maria for inviting me to this, participate in this excellent cycle of lectures, really urgent questions and concerns about the role of photography in making change in the world, both historically and in our moment. Thank you to Roger for interpretation, and thank you to all of you who are attending today, for taking the time this evening or this morning, whatever time zone you're in. So since its inception in the United States in 1839, photography has functioned as a cultural site of subjugation as well as a technology for liberation. Black Americans keenly understood the medium's pitfalls and possibilities and have long embraced photography to represent themselves as they chose, while also challenging anti-Black visual logics. From portraiture to photographs of state violence, from documentation of protest to snapshots of joy, photography has offered Black Americans an opportunity to reclaim, repair, remake, and reimagine Black life in national and international consciousness. So my presentation today will examine the special role photography played in the Black Power revolution of the 1960s and 1970s. I will focus on the Black Panther Party's deft visual practices and situate that movement and organization in the longer history of photography as a means of expressing Black freedom dreams from abolition to Black Lives Matter. But before we begin, I want to underscore two key points. First, that photography in the Black Power movement must be understood as part of a larger continuum of Black freedom struggle and the practice of photography. Throughout the 19th century, Black Americans understood the capacity of the medium to publicly convey notions of Black criminality and inferiority, as well as to project images of dignity and gentility. Scientists employed photography to produce race as a visualizable fact, that is to support theories of anthropomorphic difference and racial hierarchy. Abolitionists circulated photographs of whip-scarred slaves to solicit sympathy, anti-Confederate sentiment, and financial contributions to the cause of abolition. Culture makers practiced photography to casually ridicule, demonize, demean, or dehumanize. And you can see here a cycle of photographs of the lynchings of African Americans, a form of photography that was unfortunately exceptionally popular in the late 19th and early 20th century. Frederick Douglass, the famous intellectual, activist, and the most photographed man of the 19th century, and I would also say perhaps the handsomest man of the 19th century. Douglass understood photography as fundamental to a democratic society. Douglass's 1861 speech, Pictures in Progress, linked the birth of photography with abolitionist struggle and understood it as fundamental to a multiracial, equitable post-slavery society. Douglass asserted that through photography, even the humblest serving girl could represent herself as she chose to be seen. For Douglass, the right to represent oneself, both politically and culturally, had to be understood as the bedrock of a true democracy. Subsequent activists and individuals have employed photography as a liberatory tool of Black self-representation, as a mode of documentation of the brutalities experienced by Black peoples under racial dictatorship, and as an archive of possibility, affecting a rupture in the now and imagining other modes of living. Black visuality, then, is inextricable from Black American movement efforts to change the conditions of Black people's lives. Not least of that to be transformed is the individual and collective sense of power, efficacy, and being in the world. That is how we see Blackness, the meanings we attach to Black people, and the value we attach to Black life because of this site. These were all part of Black American movement efforts to change the conditions of Black people's lives. In the words of scholar Sarah Lewis, vision and justice are urgently bound together. So that's my first point. My second point is this. While we can understand the Black freedom struggle as always engaging the visual, we must also pay attention to the distinct practices of the Black Power movement and of the Black Panther Party specifically in its moment. Black Power's engagement of and with photography marks a divergence from that of the civil rights movement of only a few years earlier. Photographic practices of the modern civil rights movement from the late 1950s through the mid-1960s often appealed to white spectators. The aim was to capture evidence of white brutality and the contradictions of American democracy around race. The work was to transmit these truths to watching and judging audiences. And we can see in these images of by photojournalist Charles Moore from Birmingham, Alabama in 1963, that part of the visual aesthetics of the civil rights movement depended on the vulnerability of Black bodies, of Black people, in a sense to invite spectators, often white spectators, to join the struggle and to feel space for their own power to affect change. But these practices in the civil rights movement generally held faith in photography's capacity for truth-telling and influencing social action. In a few short years from civil rights to Black Power, the uses of photography in these two movements demonstrate a shift in race and the politics of photography itself. From faith in the photograph as righteous witness to open skepticism and irreverence. From the photograph enlisted as documentary evidence to the photograph as part of a performative ensemble. From visualizing Black respectability and suffering in order to lay claim to the rights of citizenship, to a refusal of such positive image traps, and from a belief in the unifying power of a single photograph to represent and build a movement, to an embrace of photography as heteroscopic, in which differences cannot and should not be contained. Thus, the Black Panther Party's use of photography in the context of the Black Power movement is not only part of a longer visual revolution, but itself marks a turn in the history of Black visuality. This turn is one that refused the positive image, and by positive here we mean palatable to white viewers. Instead, Black Power favored images that affirm Black subjectivity on its own terms. Images such as these by photographer Kwame Braithwaite, and that instead subjected the state to a Black gaze. So to better understand how the Black Panthers spoke revolution through photography, let us turn to two of perhaps the best known, well-known images of the Black Panther Party. The first is of Black Panther Party co-founder and Minister of Defense Huey P. Newton, seated in a wicker fan chair made in 1967. And the second photograph, let's see if I can get to that, features Black Panther Communications Secretary Kathleen Cleaver standing in a doorway wielding a shotgun. And this image and poster was made in 1968. And if we were in person, I would just ask by a show of hands how many people have seen these images. I'm going to assume that many of you have. And if you haven't, we can talk about that in the question and answer period. Both photographs feature Panther leaders bearing arms and looking directly at the camera. Newton and Cleaver each fill their respective images frames with fearsome poses. They are at once deeply alluring and distinctly unapproachable. Both photographs were carefully staged by Panthers and their allies, who paid close attention to framing, to fashion, and to mise-en-scène, eliciting portraits that, in the words of Panther ally French writer Jean Genet, attack first by sight. And in doing so, the images are also still laden with iconography and symbolism. Each image was made into a poster in order to generate awareness, raise funds, produce desire, and produce identifiable celebrity-like icons. The eyes shadowed in the case of Newton or covered by sunglasses in Cleaver's image, these images suggest that Blackness is neither readily knowable or easily palatable. Rather, they suggest a force to be reckoned with, in line with revolutionary nation-building projects and visual aesthetics across the globe. These photographs helped to exemplify Black American Revolution and came to embody the image of the Black American revolutionary. Transformed into posters, they emerged as wildly popular with rank and file Panther membership, as well as radicals of other groups. Simultaneously, the images proved alluring to the dominant media. And these photographs are among the most well-known and most often reproduced images of Huey Newton, Kathleen Cleaver, and by extension, the Black Panther Party to date. And I will say that where I live in the Bay Area of California, just a few short blocks from Oakland, California, where the Black Panther Party was first born in 1966, particularly the image of Huey Newton has become the staging ground for museum exhibits and monuments. There are places where, in a museum exhibit or a monument, where one can go and sit in a version of the wicker chair and have one's portrait made as a kind of homage and a way to connect with that history. So let me start by taking each photograph on its own and to tell you a little bit about it. So the Newton photograph was the Panthers' first attempt to fashion and project an image of their own making. The photograph came a few days after the Panthers had gained national and growing international publicity following their May 2nd protest at the California Capitol building. And on that day, 30 Black Panther Party members, 24 men and 6 women carrying guns, strode past an aghast then Governor Ronald Reagan into a legislative session to protest the Mapfre Act. This was an act that was also dubbed the Panther Bill, and it was designed to outlaw the display of loaded weapons. Now, this was also designed to deliberately weaken the Panther community patrols and observations of police activities, which was the Panthers' first sort of public activist work, right? To monitor, to observe police community interactions, right? Carrying guns, law books, and cameras, right? As a way to intervene in the long history of police harassment of Black communities. And so the Mapfre Act was a deliberate attempt to weaken the Panthers and their opportunities. So in this, the protest at the Capitol, the Panthers entered the Capitol and read their 10-point platform. And Bobby Seale, who you see here at the center of this image, was the party's co-founder and chairman, and he would call this protest at the Capitol the colossal event that accelerated the Panthers' notoriety and attention. And so the images then that are produced by mainstream news outlets of Black men with guns, and you can see that the women are conveniently edited out. These images would become seared into the visual landscape. And in many ways, the camera becomes permanently embedded in all future encounters between Panthers and the established press. And this photograph, as you see, the photographer is actually unidentified, and it's an Associated Press photograph that has circulated widely. So keenly aware of the power of the image and the power of personality, the new Minister of Information, Eldridge Cleaver, felt it was time to assemble, to create a Panther image of the party's making. He organized Eldridge Cleaver organized a photo shoot in the San Francisco apartment of his former fiance and his attorney, a white woman named Beverly Axelrod, and really thought very carefully about all of the elements of this image. He also enlisted the help of a photographer, named Brent Jones. And so what we see, right, is that Cleaver posed Newton in this elaborate chair on top of a zebra skin rug in Axelrod's living room. Newton is wearing the Panther uniform of black beret, which Huey Newton and Bobby Seale modeled after those worn by French Nazi resistors that Newton and Seale had once seen in a movie. The black leather jacket, a crisp powder blue shirt, and pressed black slacks. Cleaver gathered a number of African objects to serve as props, many of which came from the home Cleaver shared with his wife, Kathleen Neal Cleaver, you saw previously in the previous poster, and I'll talk about shortly. And Eldridge stood a rifle in Newton's right hand and placed one of Axelrod's African spears in his left. He leaned two of Axelrod's shields against the walls on either side of Newton, and photographer Brent Jones took several photographs of a still and stern Newton, Huey Newton, with his face partially obscured in shadow. So through the visual dramaturgy of what has become an incredibly iconic photograph, this image captured and clarified many of the ambiguities and competing strains of Black power that had adhered around the discourse since its sort of formal emergence in 1966. In many ways, we can see the African artifacts, the spears, the shields, the zebra skin rug, symbolizing a kind of cultural nationalism, a philosophy defined by a glorified African past, and the unifying force of a monolithic Black culture. It also represents a desire for a connection to both a kind of African past and a revolutionary, a contemporary revolutionary Africanness that for many Panthers who had never left the United States, this was a kind of desire for diaspora and revolutionary connection that was not consecrated not consecrated at all for many, and not consecrated for some until later. But this revolutionary nationalism, we can also see the rifle and the shells collected at Newton's feet, signifying a revolutionary nationalism, an ideology culled from the influential writings of Frantz Fanon, an identity that emerges from armed active struggle against a group's oppressor. Newton himself, Minister of Defense of the self-proclaimed vanguard organization of the Black movement in the United States, personified Black nationalism in this sense, a conviction that only Black people can best lead Black communities. And the photograph also revealed more than perhaps its makers intended. You can also see a sort of Black capitalism, a breed of Black power vociferously eschewed by the Panthers, can be inferred from the polished attire and expensive settings. To purchase such furnishings suggests financial means beyond those of the average urban inner city dweller, and it also suggests that an Afrocentric taste can be commodified and consumed. Now, this image was projected around the country and around the world. And interestingly, ironically, it was an image that Newton himself did not like. According to Kathleen Cleaver, Newton often complained that the photograph misrepresented both the party and himself. And we can see also the tension between a kind of the representation of the individual leader over what was supposed to be a movement of the people. But for others, and others like Stu Albert, a white radical and early friend of both Eldridge Cleaver and the party, other folks also felt similarly ambivalent about the image. Stu Albert recalls Eldridge Cleaver, quote, showed up at my pad and wanted to put a large personality poster of Huey seated in a wicker chair up on my wall. Because Eldridge was so happy with his new friends, I agreed. Stu Albert's enthusiasm, however, quickly changed to diffidence. But when he gave me a bunch of posters for my associates, I felt unspoken reservations about their corniness. Besides, personality posters were relatively new. Even our new San Francisco rock stars hadn't as yet made use of them. They seemed narcissistic and quasi-cultic, not really ideal food for egalitarian revolutionaries, end quote. Despite Newton's protests, Eldridge Cleaver, along with countless others who possessed and displayed the poster, many remained enthusiastic about it. And again, to go back to Stu Albert, according to him, the Newton trial, in which when Huey Newton was on trial for murder, and made the spear chic, the spear poster chic. So what we see then is that soon after this poster, not long after this poster is made, Huey Newton is arrested in a police Panther shootout, and is now facing the death penalty. And this became part of the FBI's counterintelligence program that worked to, in the words of FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover, expose, disrupt, misdirect, discredit, and otherwise neutralize the activities of the Black Panther Party and other Black nationalist organizations. And in many ways, the FBI's COINTEL program worked to, they did this, not only through sending, through telephone calls, threatening anonymous telephone calls, through destroying Panther newspapers, which was the main source of the Panthers' money, form of raising funds. But they also did this through ways of destroying the Panther image, and ultimately incarcerating and often targeting for assassination and imprisonment of Panther leadership. And so Kathleen Cleaver's role as communications secretary became to raise funds and awareness and support for the Panthers in the context of this assault by the state. And the poster, these images of an identifiable leader who was desirable, who was attractive, who stood for something, became a key way of growing the movement. And so the kind of constant recirculation, reinterpretation of these images, particularly of Cleaver in the chair, in the wicker chair, became key to the Panthers' support for itself and the circulation of its revolutionary image. And so we see that the poster could be found, was everywhere in many ways, right? It was in the front windows of Panther offices from Oakland to Harlem to Algeria. The party's newspaper, the Black Panther Community News Service reproduced the photograph a number of times on the cover and within the publication. Protesters attached the poster to sticks and raised it above their heads at Free Huey demonstrations. College students of all races and ethnicities hung it on their dorm room walls. The image traveled internationally as well. The Organization of Solidarity of the Peoples of Africa, Asia, and Latin America, OPSOL, for example, known for a pioneering revolutionary aesthetic, incorporated the poster into posters and postcards of their own. Likewise, the dominant media replicated the image. The New York Times, in particular, would reproduce the photograph at least twice, in 1967 and 1968, accompanying articles that simultaneously made light of the Panthers' what they understood as the Panthers' absurd theatricality while playing up their violent threat. Esquire, the men's magazine at the forefront of the self-reflexive new journalism trend, dissected the image in a wry, sarcastic guide to understanding the Panthers. Another photographer, Ted Straczynski, partially restaged the image not long after the Panthers' eruption onto the national stage. In Straczynski's image, Newton sits beatifically with a cigarette in hand, and the poster is affixed to the wall behind him. Dressed in the same clothes, it's not really clear which is the image and which is its reference. Even in COINTELPRO, the FBI remarked upon the photograph in reports on the Panthers. Many observers and participants viewed the Panthers' style, rhetoric, and image as circulated through photography as the outward manifestation and best representation of the party's political platform. I think for me, one of the most striking and compelling contexts in which the image signified was in a 1968 photograph taken of the poster in the window of the Oakland Black Panther office. This is sort of series of photographs, but these images were made by Stephen Seamus, who was a young white man from Berkeley, California, and a close ally of the Panthers. And he took a series of photographs, and you can see this photograph of the Panther office sandbagged for protection against an imminent or expected police assault. But also in these side-by-side photographs or uses of the poster on the cover of the Black Panther newspaper, the one on the left shows the poster of Newton in the window, the cracked window of the party headquarters that had been shot full with bullet holes by two drunken Oakland, California police officers not long after Newton's conviction on charges of voluntary manslaughter in September 1968. So behind the fractured but not quite broken glass, the Minister of Defense sits full frame in the wicker chair. As the front of this special issue attests, the tattered poster represents it literally covers the extensive written and visual list of murdered and incarcerated Panthers, as well as attacked and destroyed Panther offices. And so the cover is particularly arresting when juxtaposed with the prior week's front page on your right. The same image tinted a Panther powder blue without text and completely unscathed, celebrating Newton's birthday. So here we have a cover that is an image of violence perpetrated first against an individual. So by 1970, both Newton and Eldridge Cleaver were facing trial for police shootouts in which each had sustained gunshot wounds. Only 2 months earlier, in 1969, the leaders of the Illinois chapters, Panther chapters in Chicago and Peoria, Fred Hampton and Mark Clark, had been gunned down by police as they slept in Hampton's Chicago apartment. But so it's an image against individual, but it's also an image of violence against the offices and the party. And finally, as the full cover of the newspaper, it is an image of violence that confronts readers with life-sized bullet holes, impressing upon them their own proximity and vulnerability to state aggression. Despite, though, the FBI police assault on the Panther, Newton and the party he leads, the paper tells us, remain stoic and resolute. So the reproduction of this photograph reveals that the Panthers understood themselves as under attack, their ideas, their image, as well as their physical persons. As such, they staged their opposition not only through rhetoric, through their programming and through public actions, but through spectacle as well. So the realm of the visual, of image, of performance, of culture here emerges for the Panthers and Black Power more broadly as a significant battleground in the field of politics. So let me turn to the second poster. When Kathleen Cleaver began working with the Black Panther Party officially in 1967, she found herself thrust into the maelstrom created by Newton's incarceration. From her experience working with SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, a major organization of the civil rights movement, Cleaver created the position of communications secretary based on what she had seen their communications secretary, SNCC communications secretary, Julian Bond, do. She wrote, "I sent out press releases. I got photographers and journalists to publish stories about us. I designed posters." At 24 years old, Kathleen Cleaver was growing comfortable with, quote, the popping of flashbulbs and press of crowds. It felt unsettling, becoming known to thousands of people, but it was exciting to have our message broadcast so widely, end quote. She, in the course of a few short years, months, Kathleen Cleaver had honed her talking points, she learned her angles, she developed her personal style, and had grown confident in her capacity to lead a movement. And so in 1968, with the federal government's, with COINTELPRO in high gear, Kathleen Cleaver took a lead and organized this image. So here in 1968, Kathleen wields a heavy gauge pump shotgun as she stands guard at the entrance to the San Francisco apartment she shared with her husband, Eldridge Cleaver. Kathleen had purchased the gun immediately after Oakland police shot through the plate glass windows of the Panther headquarters in Oakland. So not long after this image, the events that led to this image had taken place. Kathleen and Eldridge had already endured months of FBI and police surveillance since moving into the gray Victorian house in San Francisco. And the attack on the party headquarters only confirmed for them the need to protect themselves and their home. Eldridge was a convicted felon on parole and was now facing his own trial for his part in a shootout with police. And as such, Eldridge could not be seen with guns, nor have any registered in his name. Thus, Eldridge, Kathleen, Bobby Seale, Panther Chairman Bobby Seale, and again, Stu Albert crafted a publicity event to circulate the story and image of Kathleen arming herself to protect her home. Image and text would offer a message of inspiration to Panther rank and file membership, as well as issue a warning to Panther detractors and self-declared enemies. To produce an attention-grabbing cover story, the Cleavers enlisted writers Marvin Garson and Stu Albert, who both wrote for Bay Area radical newspapers, and Alan Copeland, a white photographer who would later form Photon West Agency with Stephen Shamus. So the articles that Garson and Albert wrote about this event are buried in the archives. But the photograph of that encounter, of that conversation, have become iconic. Kathleen describes herself as usual wearing a short black skirt, a black turtleneck sweater, a leather jacket, and high black boots for the photograph. And as soon as she took the image, as soon as the image was made, she knew immediately that the photographs were, in her words, striking. And she immediately had hundreds printed up for a campaign poster. Now the photograph is loud. It's amplified by its transformation into a campaign poster, and it's underscored by Malcolm X's ultimatum, the ballot or the bullet. Now we can also situate this image within the larger frame of representations of Black women in the Panther Party. Panther women, many have noted the masculinist dimensions of the Black Panther Party, and specifically the ways in which images of armed women at once overly sexualized their female subjects, and at the same time ungendered them under the banner of a Black manhood regenerated through violence. Black women in many images became at once fetish objects bearing other fetish objects, and they became sometimes it's sort of invisible mimics in the iconography of revolutionary male Blackness. As Elaine Brown would write in a poem, Elaine Brown was at one point became the chairman of the party. We'll just have to get guns and be men. This was a song actually that Elaine Brown sang. And these photographs and the practices they document, but we can also see them as a kind of a connection to the international iconography coming out of revolutionary struggles in Asia and Latin America. So some of the inspiration for imaging Black women with guns came from China and Vietnam, for example, which foregrounded women as key to the success of anti-colonial struggles. And this photograph of Kathleen Cleaver certainly signals the necessity of women on the front lines, right? That Kathleen has to not only is defender not only of the hearth of her home, but of the right of Black people to defend themselves in the face of her husband's uncitizen making by the state. So we have a set of kind of competing and often contradictory visual images of Black manhood and womanhood in the Black Panther Party that reveal in some ways that photography was a terrain on which negotiations about gender took place. Okay, so Where I would like to go from here is to think about Panther visuality and photography as political practices that not only tell us about the party itself, but about the elaboration of Blackness in the global revolution of the 1960s. We can neither dismiss, the Panthers' media savvy and images of excess, nor can we exonerate the dominant media for its very real collusion with the FBI to discredit and undo the Panthers. That is to say, there are no sort of good actors and bad actors. There are no innocents here, but a very kind of knowing and complicated dance between actors in this scenario. And so rather, I think we should situate the Black Panther Party within its media moment, one marked by the proliferation of media technologies among both in a period in which we have consolidating media conglomerates and decolonizing nations. We have the rise in the 60s, the rise of new journalism and the radicalization of the underground press. And this is a moment, the moment in which the Panthers emerge is one in which the society, the spectacle, meets the rising tide of the third world. The Panthers, alongside many other revolutionary struggles globally, were very keen, understood that they needed to control media as well as technology and technological output. And that to control their image and the modes of its dissemination were going to be fundamental to the success of a revolution. So I'd like to take a moment to place the Panther Party within the historical mediascape of its moment. In the late 1960s, French situationist Guy Debord theorized spectacle as a way in which capitalism and the state work together primarily through mass-produced images to promote an ideology that perpetuates state control, state and corporate control. In the society of the spectacle, visual technologies are mobilized to reify and commodify human relationships. Reality becomes a series of representations, and society exists through that spectacle. Rather than unifying, however, spectacle alienates and isolates people from themselves and one another, from the real experiences of everyday life, rendering them complicit and politically impotent. Spectacle is a means of maintaining hegemony or the cultural logic of late capital. It works in a variety of ways, but all of which seem to advance the interests of the dominant class. And so we might consider Black Panther public performances as examples of situations, as Debord's words, constructed encounters and creatively lived moments in specific urban settings, instances of a critically transformed everyday life. And these situations that situationists argued were a means of challenging alienation and oppression by the system. But more than anti-art art, the Panthers' insurgent visibility signals a longer, complex history of Black refusal announced publicly. In a sense, Black people and Black bodies have always been part of a capitalist spectacle that maintained its power through representation. The space between Black subjectivity and the Black imago, right, the imagined mental image of Blacks, secured the reification and commodification of Black bodies, and as such had long resulted in a Black experience of alienation and what W.E.B. Du Bois called double consciousness, kind of split self, the experience of always seeing oneself through the eyes of the other. Yet if, as Du Bois tells us, the spectacle is the self-portrait of power in the age of power's totalitarian rule over the conditions of existence, then the Panther's engagement in and use of spectacle becomes carnivalesque. It becomes a derisive inversion of power's projected image of itself. Even more so, rather than the tool of power alone, spectacle proves necessary to negate the negation of life, to repudiate the ideology perpetuated by the state. More than simply being seen to be free and revolutionary within Black communities throughout the United States and throughout the world, the Panthers offered up the visual as a stage or battleground in and of itself. And did so that emerged from a state of negotiated set of historical processes, from a lengthy past of state counterinsurgency that worked to eviscerate Black subjectivity by controlling its visibility while also erasing the state's own performative work to render Black communities voiceless, powerless, and marginalized. Spectacle, like whiteness, derives much of its power from its own naturalness. For the state, spectacle functions as the facade, the smoke and mirrors behind which it hides its manipulation and brawn. Through the exploitation of spectacle, through political presence, and through their harnessing of photography, the Panthers undertook the important task of making those traces of force, strength, and power materialize. So in the final moments, in my conclusion, I want to kind of think about some other images and ask, how do we understand the Panthers' visual revolution in our current moment? And since the 1960s, the imagery and iconography of Black Panther, of Black Power, and of the Panthers in particular, has been the staging ground for articulations of, Afrofuturist imaginings. Is in the case of the film Black Panther, of cartoonish radicalism. We can think of the ways in which Michelle Obama was portrayed as, was cartooned as a Black Panther, to kind of use her radicalness as a wedge between Barack Obama and other voters, and also as iconography of dangerous resistance. These images were highly reproduced, widely circulated, and occasionally imitated. They are the origins of fantasies and dreams, and also nightmares of revanchist white supremacists. And indeed, while we see some of the visual aesthetics of the Panther visual aesthetics reproduced in contemporary movements, the work of the camera, so for example, we can see the work of the camera as witness, the fearsomeness of some protesters. I think increasingly the photographic practices of Black freedom struggles in our moment are turned away from the disciplining requirements of the camera that coerces Black performance. Instead, we see images that are attuned to expressions of communal joy and meditative rest. And so I would like to close with a photograph that I've only recently come to know through my work organizing Kathleen Cleaver's personal photography archive. That archive is now is now available at Emory University's archives in Atlanta, Georgia. This photograph that you're looking at was made a year after the ballot or the bullet poster, and 6,000 miles away in Algiers, while Kathleen, Eldridge, and their 2 children were living in exile from the United States. Here, Kathleen is seated in a black chair, holding reading material with one hand and a beverage in the other. She wears a casual sleeveless top and rust-colored pants. Her gaze is averted from the camera and its unknown photographer, unknown to us, but likely very familiar to Kathleen. Instead, her attention is focused on the book in her lap. A towel is wrapped around her head, suggesting she's just washed her hair, tending to the afro that was so central to her public image. The afro was a source of pride, a marker of militancy, and as Sister Radical Angela Davis noted in the charged anti-Black power moment, the afro also served as, quote, a historical pretext for something akin to a reign of terror for countless young Black women. So Black women who had afros were surveilled and harassed by law enforcement for wearing their hair natural and large. Yet here in this intimate photograph, the afro is here unseen and protected, and Kathleen's alone. This color snapshot is affixed to a page of a family album where beneath the photograph, Kathleen is written Point Pescad. And so this date, November 1969, and the date indicates that this is the first home that she and Eldridge have shared since the house on Pine Street where she staged the ballot or bullet photograph. Since Eldridge fled almost certain imprisonment and possible execution in the United States for exile in Cuba and then Algeria, and since Kathleen joined him in Algeria. This photograph, I think, is as quiet as the ballot or bullet poster is loud. It's quiet in the way that scholar Kevin Quashie invokes that word. It's not silent or silenced, but inward facing. It's selfful. It's suggesting surrender. This photograph is intimate and meditative. It is full of breath and air and a stillness that is not immobile, a calm that suggests the capacity to receive. Like the towel wrapped carefully around her hair, the photograph outlines Kathleen's interiority, acknowledging its presence while withholding its substance. Though an internationally known activist and icon, here Kathleen is inside her home, the home, a version of the home that she was protecting in the ballot or bullet photograph. She is indifferent to the photographer and by extension indifferent to us, but she is fully present to herself. Perhaps above all, this is an image of an icon of the Black radical tradition at rest. Whatever Kathleen is protecting so fiercely in this photograph is hers and hers alone. And I think it offers a message for thinking about photography and the Black revolutions to come. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this wonderful lecture, which I found very interesting because when we address photography and revolution, we always expect a kind of presentation that has to do with the documentation of revolution. Photography is a document, but your approach is very interesting because it shows photography as a weapon, not just as a way of documenting history, but as a weapon and a network, a kind of net that can bring together people who might sympathize with the cause. But one thing that has struck me is that these pictures that you've shown us as sort of ways that were used to popularize the cause are pictures, as you say, of the leader. so that the person who leads the struggle, but there's no representation of the grassroots, of the masses, of the community. They're not there in those pictures. The community and the people, and especially in the case of Black Power and the Black Panther Revolution, there's a whole community involved in that. So it's not so much a cause as it is a community that is struggling towards freedom. So why do you think that community is not reflected there? And why did the Black Panther Party not produce an icon that had to do with the people and that showed the people?
Mm-hmm. That is a fabulous set of questions. First, thank you. I love the way you put that, Laura. Photography as a weapon and as a network, as a way to build relationships in communities. And I think that's exactly, you put it so beautifully and succinctly. I think that's exactly how the Panther Party in particularly wielded photography in its moment. And yes, these images, the posters, and I focused on the sort of these two very iconic images, do focus problematically on Panther leadership, on the individual. And I think that first took the role as a tried to convey a little bit in that as the FBI was targeting Panther leadership and incarcerating them, these individuals became the causes of the party, right? The party had to raise money for their legal defense funds. They had to keep pressure on, on the public so that these Panthers would not be forgotten in prison. And certainly, I mean, there are a number of Black Panthers who remain incarcerated or in exile to this day, right? From that moment. And so part of what photography could do was to create an image and a relationship to very vulnerable Panther leadership who are facing state persecution. However, I will say there are images of rank and file membership, but I think those images the Panthers start to forcefully make those or consciously cultivate those images in the midst as the movement develops, in part because first they recognize that, for example, while most of the leadership is male, something like 2/3 of rank and file membership of the party are women. And it's the women who are doing the free breakfast programs, the medical programs. They are keeping the party running in the day-to-day. And so how to represent that? Secondly, I think what starts to happen is as the public opinion against the Panthers are turning, the Panthers start to realize they need to kind of, I don't want to say soften their image, but they need to broaden, let's say, their image. And so Kathleen Cleaver hires or works, reaches out to a number of local photographers, including Ruth Marion Baruch and Perkle Jones, Jeffrey Blankford, Stephen Shames, and others, but particularly Ruth Marion Baruch and Perkle Jones, who were kind of more portraitist and social realist photographers in the moment, to explicitly make portraits of Black Panther rank and file membership, and and then Kathleen organizes a photography exhibition of their photographs of Ruth Marion Baruch and Perkle Jones's images, to help change, to create a new public image and narrative around the Panthers. But I think that question of focusing on the leadership, both in image and in practice in the movement, is actually one of the lessons then that the Black Lives Matter movement learned from the Black Panther Party, such that the Black Lives Matter is a kind of decentralized movement with very few recognizable leaders, right? Leaders who don't get photographed individually, right? But really you get photographed, as a collective. And I think it's also a distinction between the visual aesthetics in many ways of a certain kind of nationalism and vanguardism versus the aesthetic that is, I think, has emerged since in thinking how do we photograph the collective.
Sí, precisamente, mira, tenemos
Yes, we've got a question from Alfredo Dominguez Martin, that refers to what you've just mentioned. What's the situation today with regarding photography and the movement, the Black movement in America?
My goodness, thank you. That is a great question. I think a number of things are happening with the sort of the question of photography, and it's always in contemporary movements. And I think one of the places we have to start always is access to technology and what that makes possible. I think so much of the current movement for Black lives in the United States is driven, the sort of photographic is visually driven by this, right? By our cell phones, by the proliferation of images of, police violence against Black people that has been captured by, everyday folks on their cell phones and then circulated via social media. That was the initial work actually of, as I mentioned, of the Black Panther Party. That's where they started, right? Was to actually do that documentary work of recording, as well as intervening in police Black community interactions. And I think the circulation and the proliferation of cell phone images has had a number of different effects on the movement. On one hand, these images have galvanized the movement, as we certainly saw, both in 2015 and again in the summer of 2020 with the murder of George Floyd. Those videos, those images, moved people into the streets, right, in a pandemic. And that is sort of going back to Laura's point about the important documentary capacity of photography to do a particularly kind of consciousness raising and galvanizing work. So we can't deny, I think, the power of images in that way, and certainly to the organizing of contemporary Black social movements in the United States. At the same time, we are starting to understand the incredible psychological toll that the proliferation of those images takes, especially on people who identify as Black. And certainly if we think about how we receive those images, right? So if we're watching a video on YouTube and autoplay is set, and so the videos are just rolling, right? Or we're scrolling through our Twitter feed or our Instagram feed. And so in a sense, we actually have no control. We have very little control over how or when or where we are consuming, really snuff films, right? Images of murder and extreme violence. And so I think what that has had, that kind of the recognition of the weight of those images and videos has, I think, created a yearning for a different kind of visual aesthetic of movement. And so I ended, the photograph that I ended with, I think are actually in line of Kathleen seated and quiet and sort of enjoying a private moment, I think is more of what we're starting to see. So for example, the Movement for Black Lives in the summer of 2020 put out a series of videos of people protesting, but all of the protesting is set to music. They're dancing, they're images of joy. And I think that has sort of where a kind of movement aesthetic, Black movement aesthetic is the aesthetic that it's embracing, right? How do we make space for the fullness of Black life in the midst of terror, and bodily precarity, in the extreme atmosphere of anti-Black violence? How do we understand Black life as valuable and full, right, to ourselves? I think the last thing I will say that we're also seeing in the movement is a recognition of the ways in which photography both surveils and celebrates in the same breath, right? So that a lot of what we also saw last summer was practices of photography that chose or that urged people to not photograph faces, to pixelate people's faces so that they could not be identified via by law enforcement. And I think that's also a really powerful recognition, again, against the kinds of images of the Panthers, right, where part of it, right, we want to be seen to be free, we want the recognition of the leader, and realizing that kind of publicity and visibility is not in, as we've been taught kind of in, Enlightenment thinking, that to see is to know, to see is, that we want to be visible and recognized, but that actually that kind of visibility is itself a trap. Thank you for your question.
Tenemos otra pregunta.
We have another question, Leigh. The question is Nacho Pérez Tapias says, it's always struck me the impactful picture of the Afro-American athletes lifting their fist in Mexico 1968, shaking their fist in the air. It looks as if they're posing before the world in a conscious manner. The consequences for those athletes we all know about, but we don't know what the consequences were in the Black Power movement. What, in your opinion, were the consequences after those pictures were published and those athletes were punished?
Well, that's an interesting question. Thank you. I'm not sure exactly, or I think if I understand the question correctly, want to know the impact of that photograph on the Black Power movement, and also
sí, si hubo alguna consecuencia negativa para el movimiento. Si hubo
whether the movement suffered any negative consequences as a result of that picture.
Right. I mean, oh, sorry. Thank you. I think that if anything, how do I want to put it? If anything, I think that the movement, Carlos and Smith, the two Black athletes who raised their fists, and I can't remember the third person, but he was a white athlete, I believe, from Australia, who also participated in that protest. I think what that also demonstrates is, the ways in which the Black Power movement was impacting other aspects of Black cultural life. And I don't want to say becoming more mainstream, but that these conversations were spreading. And so Harry Edwards, who was a Black athlete, and also a professor of sociology at, I believe, San Jose State University, so also in the Bay Area, was already in these conversations, had ties to the Black Panther Party, and certainly was, thinking about, what was the role of Black athletes in the Black Power movement. And so one thing I think I would also want to say is that Black Power as a movement, was, I focused on the Black Panther Party today, but Black Power emerged in almost every aspect, in so many aspects and spaces of Black life, right? So the emergence on universities, Black students occupying campus buildings and demanding Black studies and ethnic studies programs and departments, understood themselves as part of Black Power and also third world liberation struggle. And so Harry Edwards and the two athletes and Carlos and Smith were part of sort of in that part of that campus movement. Black arts understood themselves as part of the Black Power movement, right? And we can see in the work of Amiri Baraka, or artists like Elizabeth Catlett or Africoba, writers, etc. So I think that if anything, what emerged is, for these athletes, that we were starting to see the ways in which the ideals of Black Power, as articulated by the Black Panther Party and others, were taking hold in a range of different aspects of Black life. I hope that answers your question a bit.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much. We've got another question. Manuel Molina Muñoz says, the idea of photography as a weapon links the Black Panther Party with other movements like the anti-apartheid movement and its photographers, APIX, for instance. And the question is, do you see common ground between these two movements, the Black Panther and the anti-apartheid movement?
Absolutely. Thank you for that question. I think that this sort of one of the beautiful things about photography, or one of the things that I find most powerful about it, is the way that it circulates, that it photographs can move in a way that people can't. And I think that there are certainly movements, the ways that the photographs themselves were circulating in that moment. We know, in the Black Panther Party newspaper, for example, circulated globally. When the Cleavers were in exile in Algeria, they formed the international section of the Black Panther Party and hosted basically an embassy during the Pan-African Cultural Festival in 1969. Kathleen Cleaver spent her childhood as the daughter of a U.S. Foreign Service agent, and so had grown up in India, Philippines, Liberia, and Sierra Leone, sort of kind of in the shadow of Bandung, or in the aftermath of the Bandung conference. So these, even as the people aren't necessarily moving, the photographs are doing this work again of both of documenting and circulating, and I think also building a kind of global, helping to build a global movement against all kinds of oppression. And I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Muy bien, muchísimas gracias.
Well, good. Thank you very much, Leigh. We have no more questions until now, so I think we've been very punctual, finished very punctually. Your talk and your approach has delighted me, especially that approach of yours, that situationist approach, and the way that you've made use of, or the movement made use of, spectacle, which is a kind of tool in Europe. We see it as something very American, or belonging to the white culture of America. So this would be my final question. How is it that, how did you make use, or how did the Black movement in America make use of spectacle for a revolutionary movement like the movement of Black Power and Blackness?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a great question. I think that in my book, In Prison and Luminous Glare, I start with the anti-lynching campaigns of the late 19th and early 20th century, and then move to the civil rights and Black Power movements. And one of the things I think about taking a long view of photography and Black social movements is I think exactly what you said, the ways in which spectacle is has always actually been, or in many ways, part of the kind of visual imaginary of a white American racial dictatorship, right? There's a way in which a kind of white American right, visual aesthetic has depended upon the spectacle of its racialized others to shore up its power. And certainly that is the case. That was absolutely the case of lynching as a practice, and lynching as a subject for photography. Photographers knew, sometimes photographers worked with local governments to figure out where the lynching was going to be so that they could set up their cameras in the most advantageous location. And I think one of the questions I always had was, well, how have Black people wrested control of their images from a very fraught and limited visual terrain? There aren't a lot of options necessarily for how Black people can represent themselves in the framework of a kind of, white American, there aren't a lot of possibilities, right? It's always as other, right? And so what we saw for many, many years across certainly the first half of the 20th century is that photography, many times Black activists used photography to prove their, perform citizenship, to prove that they were not spectacles, right? That they were just like white people, that worthy of the rights of citizenship. And I think why the Panthers are so fascinating is that, at one point Eldridge Cleaver said, "I'm not interested in positive images. It's a trap." When the U.S. government is, and police are murdering Black people every day, and that needs to be, that's the spectacle, right? That is, that's the absurdity that is made banal, right? And so how then do you basically use the camera to visualize white supremacy, which chooses to remain hidden and silent and invisible? And I think that's where, at least in this moment, spectacle was a language that was always available, a visual language that was always available, but it was only really in the 1960s, in the Black Power movement, I think that Black activists, felt confident enough to say, we will present ourselves as we wish, not as palatable to you, in a way that enables us to reflect back the absurdity of the state to itself.
Muy bien, muchísimas gracias.
Thank you very much, Leigh. That response, that answer is a perfect conclusion when you talk about and a summary of everything you've said. Thank you very much for being with us and for having synthesized and summarized so much information into such a short space of time. Thank you very much to everybody who's followed us. And on Tuesday, next Tuesday, we'll meet again online. Leigh, you're invited too, if you wish to join us. We will be with Paul Goldsmith, who will give us a lecture called The Lasting Influence of the Prague Spring and the Soviet Invasion. And he will tell us his personal experience as a photographer in Prague before, during, and after the Soviet invasion in August 1968. And that's all. We expect you and hope to see you on Tuesday at 7 o'clock in the evening in this series of lectures organized by the Mapfre Foundation at the KBR in Barcelona. And have a very good day, Leigh. You've got a full day ahead of you. Have a very good day. We are wrapping up over here in Barcelona. It's night time, so thank you very much and all the best.
Have a good evening. Thank you all. I raise my coffee to you.